Hey, RezaieStrong followers. So, as many of you know, I do intermittent fasting. I've been doing it for the last 3.5 years, and I've had a lot of people ask me questions about it. And recently, I had somebody ask me, does it really work? And the reason they asked me that was because of this paper that got published in April of last year. And it basically looks at calorie restriction with or without time restricted eating in weight loss. And time restricted eating is another way of saying intermittent fasting, or IF. And so the authors of the paper basically said, let's take time restriction, which we're calling intermittent fasting, plus calorie restriction, and let's compare that to just calorie restriction alone and see which one actually reduces body weight by more at 12 months. So here's what they did. So for time restriction, basically your window to eat was from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. So this is like an 8-hour window to eat with a 16-hour fast. This is a very common 18 and 6 strategy that's used with intermittent fasting. For calorie restriction, for men, they were restricted to 1,500 to 1,800 kilocalories per day. And for women, it was 1,200 to 1,500 kilocalories per day. So basically, combine the two of those, that's one group, versus just the calorie restriction for the other group. Their outcomes, so already stated, the primary outcome of the paper was, what is the change from baseline body weight at 12 months? And then they looked at a whole bunch of other things: waist circumference, body mass index, amount of body fat, metabolic risk factors, and the list goes on. We'll get into those in just a second. It was about 139 patients, and when we look at that primary outcome of mean weight loss from baseline at 12 months, you can see after 12 months, combining intermittent fasting with a calorie restriction lost you about 8 kilograms, or as we say in the US in pounds, it's about 17 and a half pounds. And doing just calorie restriction alone, you lost about 6.3 kilograms, or the equivalent of about 14 pounds. Really not that much difference for 12-month time period. When we look at all their secondary outcomes of waist circumference, body mass index, body fat, lean body mass, blood pressure, metabolic risk factors like hypercholesterolemia, diabetes, we can see that the results were kind of consistent with the primary outcome. So there was small little increments of improvement with the intermittent fasting plus calorie restriction, but not enough to really be worthwhile, at least based on the outcomes of this study. Now, here's some big fundamental issues with this trial. The first thing is it was performed in China. The diets and lifestyles are very different than what we have in the US. They excluded patients with diabetes and cardiovascular disease, which I think these are the patients that actually would benefit the most from doing intermittent fasting. And then they didn't really control for physical activity. And so I have no idea how much physical activity one group did over another. And we know that the equation for losing weight is the calories you put in versus what you expend in a day, or essentially what you get for weight loss or weight gain. And so this is an important component that we just don't have a lot of information on in this study. My biggest issue with this trial, though, is this. When we look at the intermittent fasting plus calorie restriction, the window in which people ate was 10 hours and 23 minutes. When we look at the calorie restriction alone without doing intermittent fasting, it was 10 hours and 24 minutes. Essentially, there was no difference in the window in which people were eating, and so we're comparing intermittent fasting to intermittent fasting. There was no separation between the groups. I would expect to see that if you're going to implement something like a time restriction in the window that you're going to eat, you would like to see that there's a separation between what you do with the intermittent fasting versus when you don't. And we simply don't see that in this trial. So the bottom line is that when your intervention of your daily eating window or your intermittent fasting between groups is essentially the same, you get a result that shows no differences. This is not a shocker. So for those of you that are continuing to do intermittent fasting like myself, this study doesn't disprove what you're doing. We would need a better study that has gotten better separation in terms of time windows and then looking at those outcomes in order to say something doesn't work. It is not this trial. Thanks for tuning in. Leave me your thoughts, comments, and questions. And until next time.